Narva was not just a point on the map, nor a name difficult to pronounce in military reports. Narva was a lock, and whoever held the key could push the war into the heart of the Baltic. On one side of the city ran the Narva River, dark, cold, slow. In winter, he seemed dead, but it was there that life and death were separated by only a few meters of ice. For the German army, Narva was the last royal shield of Army Group North. Behind that city were the roads that led to Estonia, Latvia, and further. Onto East Prussia. Narva was the territory that the Germans considered part of Germany's own body. If the Red Army crossed Narva, there would be no other strong natural line to stop them. It would be like breaking down the last door of a house already on fire. The generals knew this, and the soldiers sensed it too, even without maps. They understood it from the way they were positioned, from the urgency of the orders, from the officers' dry tone. There was no retreating there. Not because it was forbidden, but because there was nowhere to go. On the other side, the Soviets viewed Narva as an obstacle that needed to be crushed. Leningrad had already resisted, the siege was broken, and now the war was advancing like an unstoppable tide. For Moscow, Narva was the last German stronghold in the north. Destroying it meant pushing the Germans back to the sea. The city itself wasn't large. Narrow streets, stone houses, an ancient fortress silently observing everything. But beneath that ordinary appearance, Narva carried an enormous weight. Every street could become a trench, every building a machine gun nest, every bridge a spot where hundreds of men would die in minutes. And then there was winter. The cold was no small detail. He was a character in history. The wind cut their faces, their fingers lost feeling, weapons jammed, the wounded froze before they could cry for help. In Narva, they didn't just fight the enemy, they fought against nature itself. So, when the first shots rang, out near the city, it was already clear to everyone, Narva would not be a quick battle. It would be a battle of attrition, of blood slowly spilled, of men being ground down day after day. Whoever held Narva would hold the north. Whoever lost it would open the door to the end, and that door was about to be broken down. Winter comes first, cold, mud, and death. Before the armies actually clashed, winter arrived as the first enemy. He didn't ask permission, he didn't wait for orders, he simply took Narva. The temperature dropped quickly, the Baltic wind cut like a blade, and the landscape became white, silent, deceptive. During the day, the ice seemed firm. At night, everything changed. The snow hid holes, mines, frozen corpses. Men walked and suddenly disappeared into icy mud or almost solid water. Some didn't scream. The shock of the cold stole their breath before the pain. German soldiers dug trenches, but the ground was as hard as stone. Shovels broke, hands bled. Many used bayonets, or even helmets to dig shallow holes, insufficient to protect from the wind or artillery. Sleeping was almost impossible. Those who did sleep too deeply, I was at risk of not waking up. The wet boots froze overnight. In the morning, men had to force their feet inside them, tearing off skin along with them. Toes turned purple, then black. Gangrene spread silently. It wasn't a gunshot wound, but it still took soldiers out of the line. The weapons also suffered. Oil thickened, bolts jammed, machine. Guns failed at the worst possible moment. A second's delay could mean death. Many soldiers learned to sleep with their rifles close to their bodies, using their own body heat to prevent them from freezing. On the Soviet side, the situation was no better. Long marches through deep snow, delayed supplies, men exhausted even before combat. But they had numbers. They could lose 100 today and send 200 tomorrow. Winter didn't choose sides. It just exacted its price. The battlefield began to fill with motionless figures, covered in white. From a distance, they seemed part of the landscape. Up close, they were men frozen in strange positions, some still holding their weapons, others with their eyes open, as if waiting for orders that would never come. In Narva, it quickly became clear those who did not respect winter would not live to face the enemy. Even before the major Soviet attack began, The cold had already won its first battle, and while the snow continued to fall, silent and relentless, something even worse was approaching. The Red Army was on its way. The Red Army approaches, the unstoppable tide. The icy silence of Narva began to be broken by a distant, continuous sound. At first, it seemed like a faint, almost imaginary thunder, but the veterans knew exactly what it was. Heavy artillery on the move. The Red Army was coming. From the white horizon emerged endless columns of men. Thick coats, stern faces, firm steps in the snow. Behind them came Toad. Cannons, rocket launchers, tanks covered in ice. It was not a force in haste. It was a machine advancing with patience and certainty. The German soldiers watched in silence. Some adjusted their helmets. Others gripped their rifles tighter. Many had seen this before, in Stalingrad, in Kursk, in Leningrad. They knew what it meant. When the Soviets came like this, they weren't there to negotiate land. The Soviet strategy was simple and brutal. First, crush. Then, advance. Artillery would prepare. The way, turning trenches into craters and villages into rubble. Then, waves of infantry would advance, no matter the cost. The goal was not to conserve men, but to break through the defense. Narva lay directly in the path of this tide. To Moscow, that city was a rusty latch holding open an old door. It only took enough force to tear it off. Soviet commanders believed that the German defenses in the north were already weak, exhausted, close to collapse. They expected to cross Narva in days. But there was something the reports didn't show. The Germans were there. They were no longer fighting for victory, but for survival. Many knew that this could be the last stand before an endless retreat. Others believed that if they held Narva, they could buy time. And time at that stage of the war was everything. As the Red Army drew closer, the sky began to change. Planes appeared, tearing through the low clouds. Bombs rained down on roads, bridges, and defensive positions. Each explosion heralded that the battle was about to truly begin. The soldiers dug deeper, reinforced positions, distributed ammunition. There were no long speeches, only short, direct orders. Exchanged glances said more than words. Everyone knew when the first shot rang out, Narva would cease to be a city and become a slaughterhouse. The tide was there, and she wouldn't stop of her own accord. Improvised defenders, the army that shouldn't exist. Looking at Narva in that winter, it's easy to imagine a solid line of well-trained, organized German soldiers ready for battle. The reality was quite different. What Narva advocated for was not an ideal army. It was a human patch, hastily stitched together to hold the impossible together. There stood veterans hardened by years of war, men who had survived sieges, retreats, and massacres. But alongside them were young men with barely any beards, hastily sent to the front lines. Many had learned to shoot weeks before, some days. The war didn't ask if they were ready. There were also foreigners, Baltic, Scandinavian, Flemish, and Dutch volunteers, men who weren't exactly fighting for Germany, but against the Soviet advance, fearing what would come next. For them, Narva was not just a military position. It was the last defense of their own lands. These soldiers spoke different languages, came from different cultures, and had different motivations, but they all shared the same icy trench, the same fear, and the same certainty. If the line broke, few would. Escape. Almost everything was lacking. Ammunition was rationed. Food arrived cold and late. Many wore patched uniforms, boots of the wrong size, and makeshift gloves. Helmets were passed from one dead man to another. Nothing was wasted. The officers knew that, on paper, that force shouldn't withstand a massive Soviet attack. But they also knew something important. Trapped men fight differently. Every soldier there understood that Narva was not a point of passage. It was a dead end. At night, in the trenches, there was hardly any talking. The wind carried the distant sound of engines and cannons. Some thought of their families, others of previous battles. Many simply stared into the darkness, waiting for the moment when it would all begin. This was the army that defended Narva, tired, poorly equipped, confused, but dangerously determined. And when the first big attack came, it wouldn't be perfect discipline that would hold the line. It would be despair. The Narva River, a line drawn. In blood, the Narva River was neither wide nor impressive at first glance. In summer, it seemed like just another tranquil waterway cutting through the landscape. In winter, however, it turned into a deadly trap. The frozen surface was deceiving. Beneath, the dark water continued to flow, waiting for any mistake. For the Germans, the river was the last natural line of defense. For the Soviets, it was an obstacle that needed to be crossed at all costs. There was no elegant maneuvering there, only brute force. Whoever crossed would live, whoever hesitated would die in the ice. When the attack began, Soviet artillery cleared the way. The sky exploded. Grenades fell on the shores, raising columns of snow, earth, and bodies. German positions trembled. Many soldiers were buried alive before they even saw the enemy. The river seemed to boil under the impact of the explosions. Then came the men. Waves of infantry advanced across the ice, running, slipping, falling. German machine guns opened. Fire without stopping. The sound was continuous, heavy, like a saw cutting through metal. Men were hit and fell, staining the ice dark red. Some tried to crawl. Others simply lay motionless, freezing where they fell. The ice began to crack under the weight of bodies, equipment, and terror. In certain places it gave way. Soldiers disappeared into the icy water, screaming for seconds before vanishing forever. Even so, the attack didn't stop. Where one fell, another advanced. Soviet officers pushed their men forward, knowing that the only way to win was drown the defense in numbers. Every meter gained cost dozens of lives. On the German side, the attrition was brutal. Machine gunners fired until their hands bled. Barrels overheated, jammed, and had to be changed hastily. Ammunition dwindled too quickly. Each cartridge had to be worth a life. The Narva River was no longer just water and ice. It had become an open graveyard. Bodies piled up, forming a macabre bridge that, ironically, helped future attackers cross. The defensive line still held, but the price was exorbitant. That day, it became clear to everyone, Narva would not be taken easily. But it also could not be defended without the river being paid for in blood. The first shock. When hell opens up, after crossing the river, the battle ceased to be distant and became, guys, it was no longer artillery falling from the sky or silhouettes running across the ice. Now, the enemies were close enough to see each other's eyes. Hell broke loose in Narva. Soviet artillery roared again, closer, more precise. Explosions tore through German trenches, hurling men and body parts into the air. The frozen ground did not absorb the impact. It returned the force. Shrapnel flew like invisible knives. Those who weren't killed by the explosion were torn apart soon after. The Soviets advanced right behind the bombardment, emerging from the smoke and snow like shadows. Shouts in Russian, short bursts of gunfire, desperate volleys. German positions were attacked from all sides. Some bunkers held out for minutes, others fell in seconds. The fighting descended into absolute chaos. Soldiers fired without hearing their own shots, deafened by the constant noise. Wounded men cried out for help, but almost no one could assist. To stop meant to die. Whoever hesitated for even a second longer missed the next person. Grenades were thrown into overcrowded trenches. They exploded, tearing off arms, legs, lives. The smell of gunpowder mingled with that of blood and wet earth. The snow, once white, was now grey, trampled, stained red. At some points, the Soviets managed to break through the first line. They entered German positions, and there the fighting turned. Hand to hand, bayonets, rifle butts, knives, men fighting like cornered animals. There was no heroism, only instinct. The Germans counterattacked in small groups, forcibly retaking lost trenches. They advanced shouting, firing at point-blank range, pushing the enemy out. Many of these positions changed hands several times in the same day. Neither side could breathe. As night fell, the battlefield was unrecognizable. Bodies scattered, weapons broken, craters smoking. The survivors barely knew where they were. But one thing was certain: the battle for Narva would not be decided quickly. The initial impact didn't break the defense, but he made it clear that what was to come would be even worse. The Narva pocket, surrounded, but not broken in the merciless winter of 1944. As the Baltic groaned under the weight of eternal snows and winds that cut like steel blades, the city of Narva, once a bastion of medieval trade on the banks of the river separating Estonia from Russia, was transformed into a cauldron of human agony. The Soviets, driven by the fury of the Great Patriotic War, advanced like an inexorable tide, their armored divisions and endless infantry devouring the frozen terrain. What had begun as a German defensive line stretching along the Narva River now shrank like a wound that closes but does not heal. The flanks, vulnerable and exposed, were pierced by coordinated assaults. T-34 tanks roaring through frozen forests, heavy artillery hammering positions with 150 meters howitzers that made the earth tremble as if hell itself were rising to the surface. Each Soviet advance was a fist clenching, tightening the siege, transforming Narva into a pocket, an island of resistance surrounded by a sea of enemies, connected to the outside world only by narrow corridors, fragile as barbed wire under constant fire. The maps, those cold, treacherous, crumpled papers, were updated in makeshift tents under the flickering light of kerosene lanterns, where German officers, with dark circles under their eyes as deep as trenches, drew red lines that moved backward hour by hour. In the morning, a hill marked as safe was taken at midday. A vital bridge, defended tooth and nail, exploded in flames at dusk. Supply roads, snaking through frozen swamps and razed villages, became death galleries. Opel Blitz trucks, loaded with ammunition and meager rations, were targeted by Soviet anti-tank batteries, exploding in fireballs that lit up the night like funeral bonfires. Drivers screamed as metal melted around them, and survivors crawled out, burned and trembling, only to be mowed down by Maxim machine guns. Each box of cartridges that miraculously arrived at the front line was received like a sacred relic, distributed with trembling hands among men whose frozen fingers could barely reload their Mauser Kar 98K rifles. The soldiers felt the siege in the air, in the smell of gunpowder that permeated everything, in the distant echo of cannons that now came from the east, west, north, and south, a sonic siege that drove their nerves mad. At night, the sky was a carpet of horrors. Flashes of explosions painted the horizon in infernal shades of orange, and the constant roar of Katyushas, those Stalinist rockets, launched rockets that howled like tormented souls, shattering trenches and men in equal measure. There was no longer a safe rear. Every hole in the ground was a potential front, every moment of rest a fragile illusion. Men slept, if one could call it sleep, with their weapons pressed against their chests, their eyes half closed, watching shadows that could be infiltrated enemy patrols. Fear was palpable, a constant companion that whispered promises of death. They will come from the left, from the right, and you will have nowhere to run. Despair settled in like frost to the bones, with soldiers imagining their distant families, unsent letters, lives interrupted by a war that swallowed them whole. The Soviets, under the command of generals like Leonid Govorov of the Leningrad Front, orchestrated the closing of the ring with cruel precision. Attacks came in successive waves, exploiting German exhaustion. First, aerial bombardments with IL-2 Sturmovik swooping down like hawks, strafing everything that moved. Then, Soviet infantry advancing en masse, shouting "Uray" as they trampled over the bodies of fallen comrades. The objective was isolating and lethal, to cut Narva off from the rest of Army Group North, to crush the defenders in a cauldron of hunger and fire. For many Soviet commanders, it was mere mathematics. overwhelming numerical superiority against a dwindling German force composed of divisions like the 11th Infantry and foreign SS volunteers. A matter of time, they murmured in their heated headquarters as they plotted the final assault. But within the pocket, something primal was awakening, a stubborn resistance that defied the logic of collapse. Instead of widespread panic, a feral determination arose, born from the absolute knowledge that there was no escape. Every trench, every makeshift bunker of logs and frozen earth became an altar of sacrifice. Soldiers defended positions to the last cartridge, knowing that retreating without orders meant the end of everything, total collapse, annihilation. Lightly wounded, with bandages stained with coagulated blood, dragged themselves back to the line, ignoring the excruciating pain of shrapnel embedded in their flesh. Doctors, exhausted and with dwindling supplies, operated in underground shelters lit by melted candles, without anesthesia beyond a swig of stolen vodka. Cries of agony were muffled with rags stuffed into their mouths so as not to attract more bombs. A silent terror where pain became a deadly secret. Some men fought for days without real sleep, sustained by a toxic mixture of adrenaline, pulverized caffeine, and the primal fear of being captured alive. Whispered stories of tortured Soviet prisoners, fingernails ripped out, eyes gouged out, fueled the despair, turning each defense into an act of collective suicide. When positions were broken, small counterattack groups formed in the shadows of the night, infiltrating enemy lines, attacking with bayonets and hand grenades, silently slaughtering sentries. These were not grand offensives like those of old at Kursk or Stalingrad, but surgical strikes born of hopelessness. A platoon retaking a lost hill, leaving behind piles of frozen Soviet bodies, only to be decimated in the next counterattack. Each tiny victory bought time, precious hours for illusory reinforcements, for evacuations that never came. Within the Narva pocket, the war shed any veil of elegant strategy, revealing its naked and bestial face, pure resistance, an animal instinct for survival where each dawn was a victory stolen from the abyss. The air smelled of death, decomposing unburied bodies, smoke from burning wood, the acidic sweat of terrified men. Terror seeped into fragmented dreams, visions of tanks crushing living comrades, of bayonets piercing entrails, of a siege closing like a noose around the neck. And yet, against all odds, the ring was not completed. The fragile corridors resisted, kept open by Herculean sacrifices. Bridges rebuilt under fire, night convoys racing against time, men dying so that others might live another day. Surrounded, yes, like rats in a creaking, crackling trap. Broken, not yet, but the pressure mounted like an inescapable blizzard, suffocating hopes, crushing spirits. And soon, even darker forces forged in the fire of fanaticism would enter the scene, raising the horror to new levels of inhumanity. The Waffen SS in the north, disciplined fanaticism and despair, while the Narva pocket writhed in agony in the dead of a frigid February in 1944, when the thermometer plunged below 20 degrees Celsius and the Baltic wind carried the lament of lost souls. Reinforcements arrived like ghosts of the night. Units of the Waffen SS, those elite divisions of the Third Reich composed of fanatical volunteers, pure Germans, Scandinavians enlisted in the Nordland Division, Estonians from the 20th SS Grenadier Division, were thrown directly into the vortex of chaos. There was no time for acclimatization. They marched from unloaded trains under bombardment, occupying trenches still warm with the blood of fallen predecessors, without prior reconnaissance, without rest beyond a hurried cigarette. For them, Narva was not a mere defensive outpost. It was the final crucible, a test of loyalty to the Führer and the ideology that had molded them into merciless war machines. These men were different, forged in a mold of steel tempered by Nazism, harder than the ice that surrounded them, more rigid than Himmler's orders. They marched in sepulchral silence, their grey field uniforms sprinkled with snow, eyes as cold as the Arctic void, fixed on the enemy horizon. Replacing the dead still stiff with rigor mortis, they took up destroyed positions, bunkers shattered by grenades, trenches filled with frozen mud and human entrails. The word retreat was anathema, a mortal sin punishable by summary execution. Narva became for them an altar of martyrdom, where defense was not tactical, but existential. Discipline was an iron chain, relentless and unbreakable. Orders came short, like whips. Hold the line! Counterattack now! Executed without hesitation, without murmurs of doubt. Where a trench fell to the Soviets, they responded immediately, advancing with steel hand granate grenades and MG-42 machine guns spewing fire at 1,200 rounds per minute, mowing down waves of attackers. Support was minimal, perhaps a lone Panzer IV roaring through the snow or a Nebelwerfer launching rockets that howled like banshees. The objective was not glorious reconquest, but absolute negation. Every meter of Estonian land was defended as if it were the heart of the Reich, paid for with blood and broken bones. The Soviets, veterans of battles like Leningrad, felt the change like a punch to the gut. Attacks that had once flowed like rivers now stagnated in swamps of carnage. SS machine guns revived from seemingly annihilated positions, spitting lead in bursts that shattered entire platoons. Counterattacks emerged from the darkness, swift and violent, SS assault groups infiltrating dark forests, blowing up enemy ammunition depots, silently slaughtering guards with combat knives. The Soviet line, which had advanced miles in previous days, now crawled, locked by a wall of fanaticism. Generals like Govorov reported in furious dispatches, "The enemy is resisting beyond reason, like possessed demons." But this resilience was a double-edged sword, sharpened at an exorbitant price. Waffen SS units suffered catastrophic losses. Each victorious counterattack left dozens of twisted bodies in the snow, glazed eyes fixed on the grey sky. Replacements were scarce. Young, poorly trained recruits arrived only to die hours later. The frozen ground became an eternal cemetery, where bodies could not be buried, piling up like firewood for the winter, attracting crows that pecked at frozen eyes. Fanaticism held the line, but blinded them to reality. Attacks were launched even in the face of overwhelming superiority, orders to resist to the end, leading to futile sacrifices. Men ran to their deaths, shouting "Heil Hitler!" Grenades strapped to their chests, exploding amidst enemy tanks. Acts of desperation that bought minutes but drained the collective soul. At night, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant crackling of Soviet campfires or the groans of dying wounded. Few spoke. Many simply stared into the void, empty eyes reflecting. Inner terror. Visions of families executed in retaliation, of a crumbling Reich, of a future reduced to a bullet in the back of the neck or a bayonet in the belly. Fear was swallowed, transformed into blind fury by ideological obligation, but despair leaked out in whispers. How much longer can we endure? They will crush us like insects. In Narva, the Waffen SS did not fight for victory. The war had already been lost since Stalingrad and Kursk. But to delay the inevitable, a bloody postponement that prolonged universal suffering. The resistance hardened the battle, transforming it into an abyss of brutality where humanity dissolved. The tougher the defense, the more savage the combat. Hand-to-hand fighting in trenches, bayonets plunged into throats, grenades exploding in confined spaces, tearing limbs and dreams apart. And soon, the war would lose any remaining sense of distance, invading the arms, the hands, the very bodies of men. A tactile hell of pain, blood, and absolute terror, where survival was as much a curse as death. Hand-to-hand combat, the war without glory. In the dark heart of the winter of 1944, when the frozen and impassive Narva River witnessed the crumbling of empires and the shattering of souls. The battle transcended the barriers of distance and technology, plunging into a primal abyss where humanity dissolved into bestial instincts. Long-range weapons, cannons that thundered like angry gods, machine guns that reaped lives hundreds of meters away, lost their relevance amidst the suffocating smoke, blinding snow, and rubble that rose like makeshift tombs. The front line, once a border marked on cold maps, shrank until it became unrecognizable. Trenches intertwined like exposed veins, crumbling basements of medieval buildings, narrow corridors of bombed houses where the echo of footsteps betrayed the presence of death. Now, the war was no longer a dance of projectiles and strategies. It was man against man, flesh against flesh, in a deadly embrace that smelled of sweat, blood, and absolute terror. The attacks began with the orchestrated chaos of explosions, artillery shells tearing through the air with demonic howls, ripping earth and bodies apart in a symphony of destruction that left ears ringing and hearts racing. But as the assault waves approached, the noise gave way to a tense, oppressive silence, broken only by the panting breaths of exhausted men and hurried footsteps on compacted snow mixed with fragments of bone and metal. Soldiers emerged from the shadows like vengeful ghosts, mere meters away, so close that one could see the whites of the enemy's eyes, the trembling of lips parched by the cold, the terror reflected in dilated pupils. There was no time for precise aiming, for tactical calculations. Shots were instinctive, guided by a primal panic that transformed rifles into extensions of trembling arms. Whoever made a mistake, whether due to a second of hesitation, a frozen finger slipping on the trigger, paid with their life, falling into a pool of blood that spread like red ink on the immaculate white of the snow. Grenades were thrown almost blindly, rolling through narrow trenches like venomous snakes, exploding in such tight confines that the shrapnel injured both the thrower and the target. Trenches, those ditches dug into the frozen earth, became deadly traps, walls of frozen mud and shattered sandbags, filled with bodies piled like rotting firewood, where a slip meant tumbling over the dead, feeling the cold rigidity of fallen comrades, or becoming the next in the pile, with a bayonet embedded in the chest. The fear was visceral, a knot in the stomach that made bile rise to the throat. Imagining oneself trapped there under the weight of bodies, suffocating amidst the stench of decomposition, accelerated by the cold, while enemies trampled above, laughing or shouting in foreign languages. Bayonets, those relics of ancient wars, resurfaced as instruments of primitive carnage, sharp blades fixed to rifles used to pierce, tear, and eviscerate in grappling fights where men rolled on the icy ground, gloved hands tightening around throats, teeth clenched against faces smeared with soot and blood. Trench knives, bent shovels used as axes, rifle butts crushing skulls, all served in the macabre dance of despair. There were no beautiful words, no hymns of glory, only animal grunts, muffled groans of pain, the damp sound of blades piercing flesh. Men fought for seconds of survival, driven by a fear that eclipsed everything. The terror of feeling life slip through open wounds, of seeing entrails exposed to the frigid air, of knowing that distant family would never hear the last farewell whispered in delirium. Inside the destroyed houses, remnants of medieval Narva, with ancient towers now riddled with shell holes and walls crumbling like sandcastles beneath the tide, the fighting reached peaks of claustrophobic horror. Broken staircases creaked under heavy boots, torn-off doors hung like mute sentinels, smoke-filled rooms where visibility was reduced to vague silhouettes. Soldiers climbed steps with their hearts in their mouths, expecting the enemy around every turn, a Soviet hidden behind a fallen beam, a German lurking in a dark attic. Sometimes the encounter was immediate, a point-blank shot that exploded faces into an unrecognizable mass, the smell of gunpowder burning nostrils. At other times, the deceptive silence stretched on, a psychological torment that sent icy sweat down the spine until a shadow moved and hell broke loose. Fights in confined spaces where bullets ricocheted off brick walls, wounding allies and enemies alike. The ground became a slippery swamp of blood, viscous and sticky, mixed with entrails and fragments of torn uniforms. The snow, once pure as a virgin mantle, lost all trace of white, tinged with a dark red that froze into brittle crusts. The smell was unbearable, a constant. Nausea, acrid gunpowder, rancid sweat from days without bathing, the metallic iron of fresh blood, the putrid stench of infected wounds. Many men vomited bitter bile amidst the chaos, wiping their mouths with dirty sleeves and continuing the fight, driven by an adrenaline that masked the imminent collapse. No one was prepared for such an abyss, no matter how many battles they had already faced. From Stalingrad to Kursk, from Monte Cassino to Leningrad. Nothing compared to the intimate terror of seeing the enemy's face inches away, feeling their last warm breath in the icy air. There was no glory in that war without veils, without immaculate heroes. No flags were raised in cinematic triumphs, nor were heroic speeches delivered about honor and homeland. Only small groups of men, grimy faces and empty eyes, trying to hold their position for another agonizing hour, counting minutes as if they were eternities. Only shattered souls trying to crawl back to the trench as night fell, covered by a cloak of darkness that hid horrors, but did not erase them. In Narva, hand-to-hand combat unveiled the rawest face of war, a hungry beast that devoured dignity, dreams, and humanity. There, they did not fight for grand victory, for medals, or for lofty ideals. They fought not to die in that fleeting minute, to postpone the inevitable embrace of death that lurked in every shadow, in every gasp. And while men killed each other just steps away, in a frenzy of blood and despair that echoed through centuries of human conflict, larger and more merciless machines approached, purring like mechanical predators, ready to elevate the battlefield to a new level of total annihilation, where cold steel would meet treacherous ice in a symphony of inescapable destruction. Tanks trapped in ice, machines become coffins. When the tanks burst onto the theater of horrors at Narva, at the height of the relentless February of 1944, many, both attackers and defenders, believed that the end would come. Swiftly and inexorably, like a divine verdict. Steel against vulnerable flesh, caterpillar tracks crushing trenches as if they were eggshells, 85mm guns of Soviet T-34s promising to obliterate German resistance in the blink of an eye. For the Soviets, under the command of generals like Govorov, these armored vehicles were the ultimate hammer of vengeance, forged in the foundries of besieged Leningrad, driven by the fury of a wounded nation. For the German defenders, they were monsters emerging. From the white mist of the Baltic, shadowy silhouettes that made the ground tremble and hearts freeze with anticipated terror. But the ice, that silent traitor, lied with its seemingly solid surface, hiding traps that would transform invincible machines into metal tombs. The first tanks advanced slowly across the frozen ground, a swamp of compacted snow and icy rivers that creaked under the colossal weight of tens of tons. From a distance, they seemed invincible, rotating turrets pointing forward like accusing fingers, diesel engines roaring loudly in a rumble that drowned out the groans of the wounded, crushing snow, splintered wood, and inert bodies in a trail of devastation. Soviet crews, crammed into claustrophobic cabins filled with cigarette smoke and oil, felt a semblance of confidence. This will be over soon, they thought, ignoring the cold seeping through the metal joints. But the ice betrayed them. Under the relentless weight, the ground suddenly gave way. Tracks, sinking into holes hidden by thin layers of snow, turning advances into deadly paralysis. Immobilized tanks, engines still purring uselessly, became static targets, exposed to enemy fire like offerings on a pagan altar. The Germans, veterans of the Eastern Front, with divisions like the Feldherrnhalle and the Nederland, learned quickly from the desperation of survival. They waited patiently, letting Soviet armored vehicles advance too far, entering pre-planned kill zones. Then they attacked the vulnerable flanks. PaK-40 anti-tank guns, firing at close range, armor-piercing projectiles tearing through armor with thunderous roars. Anti-tank grenades were launched against tracks, exploding in flames that melted steel chains. Courageous soldiers, or those driven mad by terror, ran towards the mechanical monsters with improvised explosives, like TNT charges tied to sticks, knowing the act was likely suicide. Trembling hands planting death under chassis, running back as flames erupted, but many perishing in bursts of coaxial machine gun fire that cut legs and torsos. When a tank was fatally hit, the sound changed the air around it. Not a common explosion, but a muffled metallic roar, like the lament of a wounded beast. Turrets could break loose in a grotesque spin, flames escaping from hatches like dragons' tongues, consuming the interior in an instant inferno. Inside, crews screamed in unimaginable agony, drivers burning alive in melted seats, gunners choking in toxic smoke, commanders trying to open locked hatches while fire licked their skin. Many couldn't even get out, trapped by twisted metal or paralyzing panic. The steel became a crematorium oven, the tank a collective coffin where charred bodies fused to the iron, smelling of burnt flesh and spilled fuel. The terror was palpable, imagining oneself inside, feeling the heat rise, skin bubbling, lungs filling with black smoke, with no escape but the mercy of a stray bullet. Some Soviet tanks, even immobilized in the treacherous ice, continued to spew death, cannons firing from fixed positions, transforming the surrounding area into annihilation zones where nothing alive could approach. Others were hastily abandoned, still smoking, freezing there like relics of a failed advance, turrets rusting under the frost, serving as precarious shelter for infantry crouching behind perforated hulls, trembling with cold and fear. The infantry following the tanks suffered the worst, without the promised protection of steel, exposed to German machine gun and mortar fire, bodies piled up around the destroyed machines like macabre offerings. Entire platoons were mowed down in minutes, leaving piles of grey and red uniforms mixed in the snow, where wounded crawled in vain, calling for distant mothers in hoarse whispers, while the cold slowly claimed them. As the agonizing days passed, Narva transformed into a mechanical graveyard, a desolate landscape where destroyed tanks dotted the horizon like skeletons of extinct dinosaurs. They served as makeshift shelters for snipers lurking through burnt hatches, as obstacles channeling enemy attacks to predefined slaughterhouses, as macabre landmarks in whispered reports. The third burned tank on the left, the armored vehicle sunk in the ice near the bridge. The war gained new milestones, all forged in the furnace of death, where the smell of burnt diesel mingled with that of decomposition, and the wind carried ashes of indistinguishable men and machines. The machines, despite their promise of domination, did not decide the battle. The treacherous terrain, the bone-chilling cold that stiffened muscles, and the men, with their stubborn resilience born of despair, shaped destiny. And while tanks burned in eternal bonfires or froze in icy tombs, a bitter truth emerged for the Soviets. Narva would not fall easily, like a cracked nut under a hammer. The advance stalled in a swamp of mounting losses, decimated divisions, supplies exhausted by the relentless ice. Time, that capricious ally, turned against the attackers, prolonging the suffering in a spiral of terror and hopelessness, where each day brought more steel coffins and more souls lost in the vortex of war. The unexpected resistance, the breakthrough that doesn't happen. In the frigid twilight of March 1944, when the anemic sun barely managed to pierce the grey clouds that hung over the Narva Isthmus like an eternal shroud, something insidious began to corrode the minds of the Soviet commanders, men hardened by the bloody victories of Leningrad and the relentless offensive that had liberated vast stretches of Mother Russia. The days dragged on like rusty chains, and the advance, so promised on the maps drawn in headquarters, warmed by wood-burning stoves and illuminated by electric lamps stolen from devastated villages, simply did not materialize. On paper, the equation for victory was irrefutable: overwhelming numerical superiority, with Red Army divisions outnumbering the German defenders by a ratio of 3-1 or more. Heavy artillery lined up in batteries that could spit out thousands of shells per hour, turning the horizon into a sea of flames. Mass production of T-34 and KV-1 tanks, forged in the foundries of Sverdlovsk and Chelyabinsk, ready to roll over trenches like combine harvesters over wheat fields. And men, countless men, recruited from the Siberian steppes, the Ukrainian plains, the streets of Moscow, driven by Stalinist propaganda promising glory and vengeance against the fascist invader. But in the frozen reality of Narva, where the thermometer plunged to 25 degrees Celsius and the Baltic wind carried ice particles that cut the skin like razors, this superiority dissolved into a swamp of frustration and death, as if the Estonian soil itself, steeped in centuries of conquests and defeats, from the Teutonic Crusades to the Napoleonic Wars, conspired against the conquerors. Each attack was launched with the fanfare of a decisive offensive, orchestrated by generals like Leonid Govorov and Markian Popov, who, from their command posts miles away, sent orders over crackling radios, demanding breaks in the German line that would lead to the liberation of Tallinn and the collapse of Army Group North. Assault trumpets blared, followed by the roar of engines and the thunder of cannons, as waves of Soviet infantry, clad in padded coats and felt boots that barely insulated against the biting cold, advanced over minefields and virgin snow, shouting hooray in unison to mask the terror that gripped their chests. But each attack ended in a grim echo of failure. The German line, composed of remnants of the 18th Army and Waffen SS units like the Netherlands and Estonian divisions, remained standing, a stubborn barrier of makeshift bunkers, barbed wire intertwined with frozen bodies, and MG-42 machine guns spewing fire at an infernal rate. The ground gained was measured in agonizing meters, 10, 20, perhaps 50 on a good day, only to be lost again in the dead of night, when German counterattacks, swift as shadows, infiltrated dark forests and recaptured positions with grenades and bayonets, leaving behind piles of Soviet dead that served as a silent warning. The Soviet soldiers, young peasants and workers, transformed into warriors by the Stalinist war machine, were beginning to feel the oppressive weight of this unexpected resistance, a burden that settled on their shoulders like ice, accumulating on their uniforms. They advanced knowing, deep in their souls hardened by years of deprivation, that they would probably not return. Visions of weeping mothers in distant huts, of children they would never know, of a simple life stolen by war, haunted their minds as they stepped on S-mines that exploded in arcs of shrapnel or faced crossfire that decimated entire ranks. They saw German positions, bombed to obliteration by Katyushas that howled like banshees, reappear hours later, occupied by ghostly defenders, men who seemed to rise from the ashes with empty eyes and feral determination. Machine guns that should have been silenced by 150 mm howitzers began firing again with renewed fury, as if the enemy were immortal, a hydra that regenerated severed heads. It was like fighting a spectre that refused to die, an adversary that defied the logic of mechanized warfare, turning each assault into a game of Russian roulette, where death was the constant gamble, and despair seeped into the lungs like frost, making short, gasping breaths echo in the silence between shots. Narva transformed into a merciless meat grinder, a cauldron where lives were crushed without pity, evoking grim memories of past battles like Verdun in the Great War or the siege of Sevastopol. Entire companies of Soviet infantry, composed of 150 to 200 men, disappeared in a single attack. They advanced in dense formation, only to be torn apart by mines, mortars, and flanking fire, leaving the IB, fields strewn with twisted bodies, faces frozen in expressions of eternal surprise, hands outstretched as if begging for mercy from the indifferent sky. Officers with red stars on their caps and Tokarev pistols in hand were killed trying to push the reluctant forward, shot by political commissars for cowardice or felled by German snipers lurking from ruins, turning every order into a death sentence. The cold did the rest, a cruel ally that weakened already exhausted bodies, frozen fingers that could barely pull triggers, wounds that festered in the damp air, marches that became ordeals where men fell to their knees, vomiting bile and blood, begging for an end that never came. The terror was palpable, a constant companion that whispered in their ears, "You're next, comrade. Your flesh will join the pile, and no one will remember your name." On the German side, the resistance seemed absurd even to themselves, a stubbornness born not of optimism, but of a profound despair bordering on nihilism. Many soldiers, a mix of veterans of the 1940 French campaign and Estonian recruits fighting for an illusory independence, no longer knew how many days had dragged on in that hell. Time blended into a grey continuum, where bloody mornings gave way to afternoons of incessant bombing and nights of terrifying vigil. Morning, afternoon, and night became a single entity, marked only by the pulsating rhythms of Soviet attacks and brief silences laden with tension, where the slightest noise, a branch breaking, a muffled cough, could herald death. They resisted because they still breathed, because the primal instinct for survival drove them to pull the trigger once more, to dig deeper into the frozen earth, to swallow the fear that threatened to paralyze them. Whispered stories from Soviet prisoners tortured in gulags or summarily executed fueled the horror, transforming every defense into a suicidal pact. Better to die fighting than to surrender to the abyss of capitulation. Soviet propaganda, broadcast through loudspeakers echoing over the frozen river, promised imminent victory, painting the Germans as cornered rats about to be crushed under the heel of the proletariat. But reality whispered of relentless attrition. Narva consumed resources with insatiable voracity, ammunition looted from dwindling stockpiles, fuel freezing in tanks, supplies arriving late on bombed roads. Men were devoured by the thousands, and time, that precious resource in a war stretching from Murmansk to Sevastopol, slipped away like blood from an open wound. Each week lost, there meant delays in other sectors of the front, where the Red Army could advance on Riga or Königsberg, but instead bled in Narva, weakening the Stalinist war machine at a critical moment, when the Western Allies were preparing their invasion of Normandy and the Reich was agonizing under aerial bombardment. The unexpected resistance did not alter the ultimate fate of the war, which was already inexorably heading towards Nazi collapse, with Berlin on the horizon as a bloody prize. But it changed the pace, like a pebble in the shoe of a giant, forcing the Red Army to pay dearly for every step. Losses reaching 100,000 men in a few weeks, something rare at that stage of the conflict, when offensives like Operation Bagration promised quick and decisive breakthroughs. Despair settled in the Soviet barracks, with generals questioning orders from Moscow, soldiers murmuring about Estonian curses, and the air heavy with a hopelessness that threatened to corrode morale like acid. And while the advance stalled in a bloody stalemate, something even more dangerous loomed for both sides. Utter exhaustion, a spectre lurking in weary bones, bloodshot eyes and hearts beating erratically under the weight of accumulated terror. Bodies were reaching their limits, muscles trembling with chronic fatigue, minds fragmenting into delirium where dead friends whispered grim advice. And when the body fails, war shows its cruelest face, a beast that devours not only flesh but human essence, transforming men into empty shells, trapped in an eternal cycle of suffering and death. Total exhaustion, when the body no longer obeys. There came a point in Narva where the body simply began to fail, Not out of cowardice, not out of lack of will, but because no human being was made to endure that for so long. The cold, the fear, and the continuous combat were taking their toll, a toll that could no longer be ignored. The soldiers barely slept. They dozed for minutes at a time, sitting in the frozen mud, waking startled at the slightest noise. Many daydreamed. They confused orders. They shot at shadows. The mind began to break down before the body. Hunger was constant. Rations arrived frozen, when they arrived at all. Some ate snow to trick their stomachs. Others chewed on anything warm they could find. Weakness made their hands tremble. Reloading a weapon became an enormous effort. Making a mistake, it could be fatal. Minor injuries became serious. A small cut would get infected. An ignored splinter would turn into a fever. Doctors worked until they collapsed, amputating with cold instruments, often without sufficient anesthesia. Screams were muffled with pieces of cloth. The pain needed to be silent. Men began to walk like old men, shoulders slumped, steps slow. Some simply stopped, sat in the trench and stayed there, staring into nothingness. They weren't dead, but they weren't entirely alive anymore either. The war had drained everything. On the Soviet side, the situation was no different. Attacks continued, but with less force. Soldiers advanced out of obligation, not conviction. Officers shouted orders to men who could barely lift their rifles. The winter and German resistance had leveled the playing field. In Narva, it became clear that this was no longer a battle of strategy or maneuvers. It was a battle of human endurance. Whoever could endure another day, another night, another attack would remain there, but nobody could endure it forever. And when even the toughest among us begin to give in, those in higher command have to make difficult decisions, decisions that seal the fate of cities, armies, and men. The Tannenberg line, the last wall. When it became clear that Narva could not be held forever, a new word began to circulate among officers and soldiers. Tannenberg, it wasn't just the name of a defensive position, it was the last wall before the abyss. The Tannenberg line was situated on high ground, composed of rugged, snow-covered hills and ancient craters. It wasn't a perfect fortress, but it was the best that was left. There the Germans could shorten the front, concentrate their remaining men, and try once again to hold off the impossible. The retreat to that line was not organized according to the manuals. It was carried out under constant fire. Units retreated while others held the enemy back with their teeth. Every abandoned meter cost lives, but to stay meant being swallowed up. Soldiers destroyed what they couldn't take with them. Cannons rendered unusable, ammunition buried, wounded carried as far as they could go. Some stayed behind, knowing they wouldn't be rescued. There were no speeches, only quick, silent glances. Everyone understood what that meant. When the Soviets realized the movement, they pressed even harder. Continuous attacks, relentless artillery fire. They wanted to turn the retreat into total collapse. They wanted to break the fleeing army, but once again, they encountered fierce resistance. On the Tannenberg line, the Germans dug new positions into the frozen ground. There was no illusion of victory, only a clear mission: save time. Each day there meant evacuating more troops, reorganizing what remained, and delaying the Soviet advance. The fighting was immediate. The Soviets attacked the hills repeatedly. They climbed under fire, slipping on snow mixed with blood. They were pushed back, only to try again hours later. The hills have become stairways of death. The Tannenberg line wasn't strong because it was perfect. It was strong because it was defended by men who had already lost everything, except for the will to survive another day. There, war reached its most brutal state: attack, resist, fall, rise. It was the last wall. If it fell, nothing would remain in the north, and the enemy had no intention of stopping. The end of resistance, the order to retreat. There comes a point in war when neither courage nor sacrifice nor bloodshed can change reality. In Narva, that moment arrived silently, not with a sudden collapse, but with a cold, weighty, inevitable decision: the order to retreat. It didn't come as a loudly announced defeat. It came in short phrases, passed from position to position, almost whispered. For many soldiers it was a shock. Not because they hadn't expected it, they all felt it was coming, but because Narva had become more than just a position. It was where they had bled, lost friends, buried comrades in the snow. The retreat was not an escape. It was a withdrawal made under constant pressure. Units left while others stayed behind, holding off the enemy for a few more hours. Men covered the retreat knowing that they might not get out of there. Some died just to buy minutes. The roads were destroyed. Vehicles got stuck. The wounded were carried on makeshift sleds, doors ripped off, pieces of wood. Many didn't survive the journey. Their bodies were left in the snow, marked quickly whenever possible. There was no time for mourning. The Soviets advanced close behind, attacking any sign of movement. Artillery rained down on retreating columns. Planes appeared whenever the sky allowed. Every step backward was taken under fire. Even so, the retreat continued, slow, painful, disciplined. Narva gradually faded into the background. Destroyed streets, burned houses, trenches filled with frozen bodies. The city that had held the north for months was now abandoned, not out of weakness, but because he had already accomplished everything he could accomplish. For many German soldiers, that was the moment they understood the ultimate truth. Narva wasn't lost in a day. He was spensman by man, until there's nothing left to offer. And as the last group walked away under the grey sky, one certainty remained, that resistance would not be forgotten any time soon. But the war was not over yet. What remained now was the legacy. Narva's legacy, the last. Frozen Battle of the East. When the gunfire finally subsided and the wind once again dominated the landscape, Narva was left behind, a open scar on the map of war. There was no victory parade. There was no celebration, only silence, snow, and thousands of bodies scattered across fields, rivers, and ruins. Narva did not change the ultimate outcome of World War II. The German army was already retreating on all fronts. Defeat was only a matter of time. But Narva changed the pace of the war in the north. For months, a tired, poorly equipped and fragmented army managed to hold back a much larger force, paying for it with almost infinite blood. For the Soviets, Narva was a costly victory. Every meter gained came at the cost of too many lives. The city taught them that, even at the end, the Wehrmacht could still bite hard when cornered. It wasn't a triumphant advance. It was a journey through a frozen hell. For the Germans, Narva became a symbol of the last moment, when it was still possible, to hold the East. After that, there would be no more solid defensive positions, only continuous retreats. Many veterans would remember Narva as the last place where they still felt part of an organized army, and not just survivors fleeing collapse. The frozen fields surrounding the city held untold stories. Soldiers buried by the snow, tanks rusting in the ice, weapons abandoned where frozen hands released them for the last time. Narva has become a cemetery without crosses, marked only by the memory of those who were there. Over time, the snow melted, the ruins were rebuilt, but the weight of that battle remained. Narva became known as the last frozen resistance of the German army in the East, the place where men fought not for victory, but for time, and where time was bought at the highest possible price. In the end, Narva left a simple yet brutal lesson. In war, it is not only the enemy who kills. The cold kills, exhaustion kills, lost hope kills, and in Narva, they all triumphed, together. Narva was not just a battle, it was a warning written in ice and blood. There, in the far north of the Eastern Front, the world watched as a retreating army decided to stop, turn around, and fight to the very limit of human endurance, not for victory, not for glory, but because there was nothing left between the enemy and the end. Every frozen trench, every burned tank, every body left in the snow told the same story. When war reaches its final stage, it ceases to be about maps and flags. It becomes a raw struggle for survival. where ordinary men are pushed to do extraordinary and terrible things. Narva held the north when everything was already crumbling. It bought time with lives. It delayed the inevitable with suffering. And it proved that, even when strategically defeated, an army can resist with a ferocity that defies logic. When the last shot rang out that winter, Narva was left behind, silent, covered in snow. But what happened there? It didn't freeze in time. It became known as the last great German resistance in the East, a place where the cold decided as much as the men, and where war showed its cruelest face. Narva fell, but he never gave up.